Hello everyone and welcome to another lesson. Today I will be covering slides 25 through 36. I will be talking about the evidence for evolution, which includes these 5 things right here. So we will talk about the fossil record, biogeography, so how organisms are distributed throughout an environment, embryology, looking at how organisms develop, anatomy, so some physical characteristics and structures, and the last being biomolecules, so things like DNA. Again, thinking about evolution here, evolution is change in a population over time in terms of those certain characteristics, a phenotype, which in turn is a change in the gene pool. Okay? So we're going to talk about those 5 supporting pieces of evidence for that. So we're going to start with the fossil record. So one, we know the age of certain strata layers and also if fossils are found in those, the age of those fossils. We also have supporting evidence as far as the age and development of the Earth. Again, 4.5 billion years old. That's about how old the Earth is. And we have been able to find fossils that date back a few billion years that gives evidence to the first cells, which is the first thing that we talked about in your notes here. Also, we have looked at the distribution of fossils, and it shows that in different layers of those rocks, if you see a fossil of an organism, you can actually look at how has it changed over time. Again, the oldest layers being at the bottom and the newer layers being at the top. Again, recall the law of superposition. Usually organisms in the same layer tend to be more similar to each other than those in different layers. And also it can show, again, the progression of a species and how it changes over time. Now, one thing that I think is super cool is what we call transitional species. Now, we have found what we call transition fossils, which show evidence of a descendant with modification and shows evolution. So these fossils that I'm going to talk about are something that links and is a common ancestor between 2 types of organisms. So I'm going to talk about Tiktaalik and Archaeopteryx. So the first one being Tiktaalik. This is a pretty notable transition fossil. There are a couple others as well that are very similar to this guy. But this technically was a fish, but it also had traits common to the first 4-footed animals. So when we started to get amphibians that transitioned to land. So this is the transition fossil between fish and the first amphibians that we have on land. We also have this fossil, which is called Archaeopteryx. It is the transition fossil between dinosaurs that were reptiles and modern birds. It had a blend of both traits, both reptile traits, more so in the face than anything else, but it also had bird-like traits in that it had wings and feathers. This picture over here to the right, this is just a rendition of what scientists think Archaeopteryx looked like. This is the actual fossil. So this is the common ancestor that would have been shared between modern birds and reptiles. And there's a whole bunch more out there, but these are probably the 2 most notable ones. So continuing talking about the fossil record. So we can determine relative age of fossils. This is just by looking at different layers of rock and comparing them to each other. So if there's an organism that is found in a rock layer here, we know that it must be older than an organism that would be found here, but it has to be younger than an organism that would be found here. That's just relative age. However, we can determine absolute age, which is an actual number of some sort. So for instance, we know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. We know approximately the age of certain fossils of the first photosynthetic organisms and the first cells, and that's cyanobacteria. And again, we use this technique called radiometric dating. We look at the isotopes, how much of that isotope has decayed, can give us a very specific age. So that was the first piece of evidence, is these fossils here. Probably the biggest point to take away from this is that we can really see how organisms, according to the fossil they left, that was left behind, how it has changed over time in order to support evolution. These transitional species being some of the biggest things as far as supporting evolution. Again, not everything that dies will become a fossil. So there are probably ancestral transitional species that did once live, but we might not necessarily have a fossil for that in the fossil record. But these two right here are some of the most well-preserved and great examples of transitional species. Now we're going to look at biogeography. So this is how organisms are distributed, and even talking about fossils and living organisms throughout an environment, or geologically speaking. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how closely related animals adapt to different environments and regions. This is also known as adaptive radiation. So radiation meaning like radiate throughout an environment. So marsupials are a good example. I also have another one as well. So for instance, in Australia, there are a lot of marsupials, meaning these are mammals that care for their young by raising them in a pouch. All of these animals that you see pictured are found in Australia and do that. Now, they all have that thing in common, that they are marsupials, but they obviously all look very different depending on the environment that they adapted to. So this is probably not a kangaroo. This is probably a wallaby. This looks like a wallaby as well. So they developed and adapted to an open environment where they have those really long, powerful legs so that they can move very fast to get away from predators. However, you have something like this guy. This is a wombat. These guys more so burrow than anything else, and they have adapted to that. And then we have things like koalas that live in the trees. So all of these organisms probably shared some common ancestor at some point, but based on the environment that they were in, adapted to that environment, and over time we get natural selection. We pick those organisms that are best suited for that environment, and eventually you get speciation. These are all completely different species. Darwin's finches were also a really good example of this, in that they were all finches, they all shared a common ancestor, but they all adapted to different areas of different islands. You can see how they adapted to those various islands based on their beak shape and size. So depending on the area that they were in, whichever bird was most likely to survive in that particular environment would develop that specific trait. So that's an example of adaptive radiation. Another example is that unrelated animals can have similar adaptations to similar but yet distant environments. So flightless birds are an example of this. So these birds are all found on different continents. However, you can see that they're all very similar in that they're flightless and they have these really long legs. And even though they don't necessarily share a common ancestor, they may have at some point, they have each adapted to the area in which they live, but they each have a very similar trait. So even though they live in similar but distant environments, they each have this trait right here, which is these long, powerful legs, most likely to outrun any predator because they are flightless birds. So again, looking at organisms, and this was Darwin's probably biggest focus, was he looked at organisms in different environments and he saw the similarities between them and used natural selection as a means to explain that. Next thing we're going to look at is the anatomy, so the physical traits of various organisms. So one thing that we're going to talk about is homologous structures. So again, that prefix homo meaning same, so similar anatomical structures within different species that shared a common ancestor. So for example, the forelimbs of wings and arms in tetrapod vertebrates. So these are animals that have a backbone that are tetrapods, meaning they have 4 limbs. So that's illustrated here at the bottom. So you can see we have a human, cat, whale, and bat, all completely different species. However, you can see how the same bone, the humerus, the radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, this is basically your fingers, how that bone has changed in each organism depending on how they have had to adapt to their environment. You will have an assignment where you have to identify these similarities. The radius and ulna are kind of hard to distinguish between, but one thing that you can remember is that the radius is always on the same side as the thumb. So those are homologous structures. We also have analogous structures. So these are structures that are similar in function and appearance, but evolved from different ancestors. So let's say wings in insects and birds. Insects and birds are completely different in terms of their ancestry. However, they both have wings, and that is in order to adapt to their specific environment. The function of flight has benefited them. The last part of anatomy that we're going to talk about is this thing called vestigial structures. Now, these are structures that seem to serve no purpose, but have been useful to ancestors. So in humans, for instance, we have a tailbone, wisdom teeth, and we also get goosebumps. The tailbone, for instance, this is no use to us. However, our ancestors, they may have had a use for that if they had a tail. In terms of our wisdom teeth, a lot of people get these removed since there is no function for them for modern humans, but long ago for our ancestors, it might have been something that was functional for them. Goosebumps, organisms that have hair, if they get goosebumps, it's actually meant to trap heat and keep them warm. But for us, since we don't have hair all over our bodies, this does not serve a purpose. In snakes and whales, for instance, they don't have any legs, but they still do have a pelvic bone and remnants of that. In snakes, even though they don't have any arms or legs, they actually still do have very small remnant of a pelvic bone if you look at their anatomy. And same thing with the whales. In the next video, I'll talk about the last 2 pieces for the evidence of evolution for embryology and biomolecules.